the analyzing and interpreting stories. This handout, I did not write this. I found this and I thought, well, this actually works great. Why repeat, it myself? This kind of looks at some of the different things that you're going to break down the story and look at to maybe figure out what's going on. All right. So again, here are some of the things, and I'm hoping that I know that in high school, English is oftentimes just basically literature classes. So many of these things should be familiar to you. If you've been out of school for a while, hopefully these will refresh your memory. If you're not sure what all of these are, and I don't give you enough information in this video, then you definitely can look these up in a dictionary. But always make sure that if you look something up, that you're looking for the literary definition. Like plot, the first one here. Plot is actually could be an acre of land, right? Like something in a cemetery, right? Obviously, we're not looking for that kind of plot. So again, try to always look for the literary equivalent, all right? So one of the first things we want to look at is, again, the plot. This is the sequence of events that happen in the story, right? So that's, again, remember the first thing we do is we read to familiarize ourselves with the story, right? So what's going on, right? And can you write a summary of the story? And how are all of the scenes connected, right? How do they lead to each other? Kind of a cause and effect kind of thing, right? Second thing we want to look at is setting, right? Setting is sometimes very important in a story. Sometimes it's just the setting. It's not necessarily anything more than that. So we have to consider how does the setting affect what's going on, right? When we talked about introductions, I use the word context. Setting is a context where, in terms of the place and the time, and not just the time in terms of maybe it's noon on a Monday, but also what century, right? Are we in a specific kind of era? So in this story, we're in the era of the British Raj, right? The Empire of Britain in Asia, right? And that's an important context for this story because we need to understand what's going on. What are the British doing there? Why are the Burmese so angry at them? Because if we don't understand that, we might not get some of the subtleties of the story. We might not understand why they're reacting to him one way and why he's reacting to them another, right? So the setting for this story is not only that it's Burma, but it's Burma at a certain time and what's going on at that time, right? Sometimes setting can almost be a character in itself. If you've ever read a story like Poe's House of Usher, the house itself, I mean, the first thing we kind of see about the house is that it resembles a skull, right? And so that's very ominous. So the house itself is a presence. Sometimes it isn't, right? So again, we have to think about if this story took place at any other time or any other place, would the same events have happened? Right? What is it about this setting that affects the atmosphere? And I think one of the things is that definitely that our narrator is not in his own country. He's definitely a fish out of water. He's outnumbered, right? He doesn't really know what he's doing. And those are all really important parts of what happens in the story, right? Number 3 is about images or words. Right, so when an author uses an image, right, you have to consider, is that important? Is there some reason why he specifically, used that imagery, right? And then, of course, the words that an author chooses. This is very important. Many times, Orwell refers to the Burmese by yellow, or he calls them beasts. Right? Think about the image of the beast. Think about the use of the word yellow. What do those things imply here? They're just not descriptions. They have, connotations. So when we look at words and images, we're thinking about not only denotation, what does it actually mean? Right? This is actually a pencil, right? We also have to think about possible connotations. Well, what am I supposed to understand? What are the emotional, historical, cultural, social contexts that are attached to this word at this time, right? And that's what we mean by looking for those images, right? The next thing, and I'm going to flip here to the PowerPoint on conflict to discuss conflict. So you can open that up. So this is specifically a presentation about conflict for this story. So conflict is basically, when we're looking at literary conflict, I mean, conflict is war, right? It's a battle of some kind. In literature, we're looking at a struggle between two forces, right? And usually context is considered from the point of view of the main character, the protagonist. So I've got some definitions there. Protagonist is the main character in the story. Please realize that a protagonist is not necessarily a hero. A hero is always a protagonist, but a protagonist is just the main character, right? Antagonist, right? This is the force or the person who is in opposition to the protagonist, right? Now, a lot of times we think of antagonist and we think of villain, but that's not necessarily true, right? Antagonist is just who is opposing the protagonist. That person might be good. If we look at a play like Macbeth, right, by Shakespeare, Macbeth is our protagonist, but he is bad, right? He is a fallen hero. Macduff is his antagonist, but Macduff is a hero, right? So again, realize that antagonist is just the opposite, and that's actually what antagonist means, right? Protagonist, agon is the Greek word for actor, right? And proto means first. So protagonist is the first actor, it's the lead character. Antagonist, anta means opposite. So this is the opposite actor to the protagonist, and that's all it means. It's the opposition. All right. So again, when we look at conflict, we can have internal or external. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And we need to find out, what is going on by asking, what does this group or character want, and what gets between that person or group and what they desire or need. Right? And realize that in long works, you can have multiple conflicts. You can have secondary characters that have their own kind of side story. In long novels or epics. I mean, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, for example, Frodo is really the protagonist because everything depends on him destroying the ring. If he doesn't destroy the ring, it doesn't matter what Aragorn or any of the other people do in the story. Sauron will win, right? So he is the main protagonist in that epic, and Sauron is his antagonist, right? But you have all these other important stories like Aragorn's story, right? And so he himself is also an important character, and at times the story focuses on him and his conflicts. So sometimes in big works you can have multiple conflicts and you can focus on them. But this is a fairly short work, and really the narrator is our main protagonist. So we're looking at it from his point of view. So we talked about external and internal conflicts. So under internal, there's only one kind of conflict, and that is person versus self. So in this kind of conflict, the thing that's getting in the way of the protagonist getting what he wants is himself, right? So if I want something, but I'm, greedy, then maybe I don't get it because it's on my own greed that brings me down, right? That's what we're looking at there. Under external conflict, we're looking at anything that's outside of the protagonist that is causing problems. So one kind might be fate or God. So there's some kind of spiritual destiny kind of thing that is challenging the protagonist. The other kind is there might be an actual individual antagonist. It's, kind of like in Star Wars, Luke versus Darth Vader, right? That's a very one-on-one kind of conflict, right? It might be person versus society. So this is where the person is going up against social rules. So that could be law, that could be tradition or culture, right? Society could be represented by a town, a government, a corporation. Sometimes you might even have just one person, but he's not acting as an individual. Instead, he is acting as the representative of the group, right? So that's what's going on in that kind of conflict. Person versus nature is where it's a natural force. So if you've seen the movie Jaws or the movie Twister, right? Those are two examples of person versus nature, but they represent two subtypes, right? So in Twister, where the meteorologist is fighting the tornadoes and he's trying to figure out a way to figure out what's going on, right? The tornadoes are not malevolent, right? They have no intent to destroy. They're just natural events, right? But in Jaws, that shark has intent. It is considered evil, right? It's just not an animal that's out there kind of killing because it's its natural thing. This shark actually seems to be very evil. And so that's the second kind of person versus nature, when nature is out to get us with intent, right? Person versus supernatural. This is where sometimes this supernatural is now added to the fate slash God, because we kind of think of that anything that is not of this world. So we think of things like fate or deities as not really necessarily being in the world with us. They are external to it. But definitely supernatural is otherworldly. It could be aliens. It could be ghosts, right? And then person versus technology. This is where this thing is maybe man-made. It's not nature. It's something that has been created. And so, if you think about the Matrix, where it's the computers, the AR that humans created, or the AI that humans have created that have turned against them. But if you're watching the Flintstones, right, back in the prehistoric times, and let's say Fred is driving and his rock wheel breaks down, that's also a kind of person versus technology. So technology does not necessarily mean modern technology. It's just anything that has been created by someone. So it could be a gun, it could be a bow and arrow, whatever. Okay, so these are the kinds of conflicts. And I think when we look at these, and we're going to look at them here in a little bit, well, let me go ahead and do that. So you can see the next page is where I've actually described all of these, right? So let's look at the different actors in this story to see what their potential conflicts are. So what do they want? So the British Empire here, it wants profit, it wants control, it wants to export its cultural and social values to civilize a place that it considers uncivilized, right? That's an aspect of imperialism, right? Imperialism is a policy where one country goes out and conquers other countries to spread its values, its traditions, but also it does so in a way to usually benefit, right? Sometimes countries go to war against other countries because they need resources, right? All of my rivers have dried up and the neighbor next to me has a lot of water. I need that water, so I'm just going to go and I'm going to take it, right? That's one kind of imperialism, when you're adding to your kingdom in order to get resources that you need to continue to survive and grow, right? So that's kind of profit. Another reason that you might choose imperialism, or once you're in an imperialistic situation, control is very important, because a lot of these people don't want you there. You have forced yourself in there. So you have to maintain a rigid kind of control, because they're always looking for ways to get at you, right? And then again, this idea of culture and social values, this kind of superiority, and we definitely see this in this story, that British culture is superior, and it's our job to save these pagans from their heathen ways. It's our job to go in there and take over this country so we can use it the way it needs to be used, because we are superior in our technology and our understanding, and these people are just, letting things go to waste, right? America certainly had that kind of thinking when it overtook or took over a lot of indigenous lands when it came here. If you read the Indian Removal Act, one of the justifications that President Jackson made for that, President Johnson, no, it's President Jackson, was that Native Americans just didn't develop the land fully. And so whites needed to take over, because we would, get much more out of the land than they did, right? Sometimes that cultural social value looks at the others as children who need to be guided. They're endangering themselves and others because they just don't know, right? So those are some of the things that the British Empire, their conflicts in this story. How do they get that, right? For the Burmese, the people who are conquered in this story, their long-term goal is independence, right? They want to be free. They want their country back. Short-term goal, we have the elephant's death in this, and we'll talk about that when we get to the story. They want this rogue elephant taken care of. And the narrator gives them many motivations for that: entertainment, the food, right? Maybe some kind of revenge for the destruction that it's caused. Right, and so now let's look at the narrator. So we're going to look at first his internal conflict. You're going to see that one of the things that he wants is he wants acceptance. He wants to be liked by his own people and the Burmese. He talks about that quite a lot. One of the first things he tells us is that he was never more hated than he was when he was in Moulmein, right? He wants to avoid looking like a fool. That's the last thing he tells us, though he does indicate that other times. But the last thing he says is, I didn't want to look like a fool, right? And he basically tells us that this is what all Englishmen's ultimate motivation in the East is, to somehow maintain their dignity, right? He wants to hold out in this job until he can return home. He hates it. He says he can't even express fully how much he despised this job that he had, and his whole purpose was just to get out as soon as possible, right? He does have conflict with his own inherent prejudices about the people. You're going to see directly and indirectly, he makes a lot of statements, or he does a lot of things that shows that he does have these prejudices, right? He has a disgust with imperialism. So he's working for his own government, and yet he says that it is evil, this imperialism. So that's a big conflict, right? That he doesn't like what he's having to do. He has sympathy for the Burmese, but that's a conflict because they don't treat him any differently than they do any officer, and he kind of takes umbrage at that. He's like, why are they making me an enemy? I feel for them, right? And then he has this great fear that he's just becoming a mask, that he's losing a sense of who he is to, in order to do his duty and be the representative of Great Britain that he's supposed to. He has to fit this mask that he's been given of this is what it means to be a British officer. And he kind of doesn't know who he is anymore, right? So these are his internal conflicts. Some of his external conflicts, the immediate one in the story is the elephant, right? He's got to resolve the problem with the elephant, but he tells us that he really doesn't know what he's doing, right? Another external conflict is having to deal with the rules that are imposed on him by his own government, right? And he tells us in the story that he can't question the laws or how things are done. He's not supposed to ask for help if he's out of depth. He's not supposed to show fear or any kind of emotion that would undermine his authority. So if he asks for help, that might indicate that he is out of his depth. So he can't do that, right? Because he always has to be right. Right. Another external conflict that he has to deal with is the aggression and the disrespect of the Burmese. Right. They are doing these things to him, and how is he supposed to react to them? Right. Right. So if you're using conflict to answer this prompt, right, look at all the possible conflicts. I mean, I gave you a whole lot. That doesn't mean there aren't others there. These are just some examples of the more obvious ones. You don't have to talk about all of them. I mean, you can explore just how one of these conflicts, and you might not see other conflicts as important or other possible conflicts as important as others, right? You can ask which are the conflicts, which are the problems that occur in the story that he kind of creates for himself, and what are the other ones that he has to deal with that are caused by other people, and the problem is that he doesn't have the skills or the ability or the resources to solve those, and yet he's been put in a position where he has to do something, right? So again, some of these other things, just kind of read through this to kind of get ideas about how to do this. And again, the last point there is, the second to the last point, what are the specific places that you can find evidence to justify your belief that this is a major conflict? And then not just look for the obvious places, but what are some of the more indirect ways to support your position? And I give you an example of that. Like, if you think that the problem that's getting in his way, maybe you see it's an internal conflict, that it's his pride, right? If he says things that, yes, I have to maintain my pride, right? That's an obvious example. But indirect ways would be, what are things that he does and says that you can see are motivated by his pride, but he doesn't actually specifically tie them to his pride, right? So you can say maybe his failure to ask for help, right? If you think he does that because he's just too prideful, well, then you would explain that, right? Other people might look at that and might ascribe that to fear or, lack of wisdom, right? There are lots of ways that you could interpret that. So how do you decide? Well, that's where you take that one step that I talked about, where you start looking and pulling out all the places where you see this potential themes, and you look at them all together and you see a pattern, right? Sometimes that's how you figure out indirect ways of supporting something, that you look at what's actually going on in terms of focusing it only on this one issue, right? Okay, so again, you have this as a PowerPoint in Brightspace. You also have it as just a PDF handout right there, that it's just like 6 of the panes on one page. If you want to print it out, I would suggest you print that one out. And again, there's a lot more there. This is just giving you some ideas. Okay. All right, so let us look at the actual story itself.